Welcome back. Still on discussion about Africa and how the world, the European Union or the European world have capped Africa previously. Joining me in the studio is Mr. ERKAN, who is in economics here in Turkey, and also from Ankara, joining me via Skype is Indera Yaburi. We're going to discuss how Africa is becoming a market hub for both Africa and for the world. So welcome to Around Africa.
Thank you.
Mr. Yaburi, also welcome from Africa in Ankara.
Thank you.
So we're going to start the discussion. I'll start with you, Mr. Nyaburi from Ankara. Previously, in decades in Europe, European powers have carved African continent into their own imperial use or success. How do you think? What is the African countries doing to welcome the development between Africa and Europe, and also Africa and China? We see like the United States trying to impose its will on Africa using the fight against terrorism and also other means to stay there in Africa. So how do you think the Africans or African countries welcome these developments?
First of all, it is important to note that Africa has been on the spotlight of global politics and economy in three important stages. The first one, as you've mentioned, was the colonial era that began in the late 1900s. This time, Africans fell victims of European imperialism, and the consequence of colonialism have had devastating effects on the continent to date. But importantly, and what we picked from this period, was the resilience and the ability of Africans to be able to fight out colonialism and get rid of it. Again, when the Cold War began in the 1930s, Africa again became in the spotlight of global politics, and then the continent was then divided on ideological lines with, between the Soviet Union and the United States. But in the recent years, what people have called the new scramble for Africa, we have seen other new actors arriving in the continent and bringing a new taste or alternative forms of relations between Africa and external actors. And the response by African countries has been consistent, even though in many cases it has been undermined. For example, you will remember that during the Cold War, there was systematic effort to have African countries not to align themselves with either the USSR or the Soviet Union. Their diversion in the recent years, for example, so-called Look East policy that many African countries have adopted, is also seen as a form of continued rebellion against the colonial actors, and a clear sign that Africa is keen on charting its future in their own way and will. So the manner in which they are welcoming these new developments is, on one hand, some people are looking at it with a positive eye, but other people are a bit skeptical, worried that their past experiences will end up repeating itself.
Yeah, true. Mr. Erwan, do you want to add something to what he just said now? If you would, like, you could give some insight on your own idea of how Africans welcome this.
Yeah, for centuries, colonialism had been an issue for Africa. Yeah. European imperial powers, especially after the Industrial Revolution era, carved up the continent of Africa for the need of raw materials, sources, mines, etc. And by processing the materials gathered from the sources of Africa, had been in search for markets to deliver, to sell the goods, machines, tools produced by themselves. Yeah. Then the search for colonies and markets was the main reason for First World War also, because the world powers were in a race for finding colonies and taking place in world markets. Yeah. Also. Today, the shape of this race has changed a lot. But now Africa, of course, is not a colony, but a non-saturating market. Yeah. For the world powers. Mm-hmm. So has the potential for the aggregate demand, and also in terms of the sources they have, in aggregate supply also. Yeah. Economic and political stability is an important issue nowadays. So the world powers of developed nations, or whatever we called it, are more into Africa because of their own needs and their own interests. Yeah, true. So we will face an environment of more economic relations between Africa and European nations, as well as China also, throughout the win-win investments. Yeah. Global trade area has now
we will come to China, but recently we saw like the EU delegation, like Angela Merkel visits some West African countries. Also, Theresa May visited some West African countries, which was UK's former colonies. Yes. And also China also coming to the continent. We see they're trying to give the win-win development between Africa and China. How do you think this is going to have impact on Africa in investment-wise?
Yes. Protectionism is an issue nowadays. After events such as Brexit and Trump, a global trade area has narrowed and will be narrowing also with Trump's actions against global trade. And Africa has the potential of being an unsaturated market in terms of the sectoral side, from textile to agriculture nowadays. China wants to be presented and also being more active in African market because of Trump's actions will be narrowed for China's economy, because China's economy used to be growth at 9%, 10% levels, and now it's has a more downside potential, 6%, 7%. And China going the new Silk Road project of President Xi Jinping has a serious potential for, because it will reincarnate the old Silk Road and revive the trade route, and the countries on that route will benefit from that. And China is going to West, will be more closer to West, also will be more closer to African continent also. China should create a new story because of the economic growth of China slowed down to 6-7% part, and they're in search of new resources to boost the economy.
Yeah, true. So Nyaburi from Ankara, you heard what Mr. Enver said. We're talking about how China is making an investment in Africa. It said it's going to be a win-win investment for Africans and China. It says in last decade, China's investment in Africa not only doubled America's investment, but also it's even more than American investment in Africa. So how do you think that this resource or this China investment in Africa going to be benefit for development of infrastructural development of Africans and Africa?
Well, China's systematic displacement of traditional actors in the continent is not by accident. Beijing is keen on making Africa one of its important destinations for manufactured goods. It's also looking at Africa as a destination for excess capital that it has, so investment. Other people have also argued that Africa can actually feed China with its huge population. So China is in Africa to stay. They are keen on making sure that they grab the attention of most African countries. And Africans are actually welcoming China as an alternative partner, because for more than 30, 40 years, their dependence on former colonies was the only alternative they had. Remember that after independence, African leaders were quite optimistic that they could drive their countries to development. But when they came into power, it seems as if they had overestimated their ability to bring development, and in turn, they tried to look for some models of economic growth from different countries, and Europe and the United States were still the most dominant in terms of successful economies, until the rise of China in the mid-1990s and early 2000s, that Africans have realized that actually economic growth can actually happen without much reforms in the political spheres. So China is not only providing capital and investment in Africa, it's also providing Africans with a kind of a new model, an alternative in which Africans can look at in their attempt to drive economic growth in the continent.
All right, true. So we know that Africans have been battling with, actually world powers are trying to make their battle in Africa with soft power. As we know, like America is trying to use soft power to gain efforts in Africa, sending aid, sending contributions to Africans, and also trying to use like the fight against terror to make sure that their armies are on ground in Africa. Also, we see they're trying to grab, let's say, use this influence to influence African politics and all. But we know Turkey is trying to also not do the same as American, but trying to give Africans a win-win development. As we know, like Turkey is helping with humanitarian aid in Africa and also other parts of Africa, like for example in Somalia and other where we have like terrorism attack and also. So how do you think the Turkish government now can manage to compete with these superpowers such as America and China in Africa?
Yeah, our president, Mr. Erdogan, takes the issue of Africa seriously. Yeah. He pointed out the relationship with Africa through investment side in many of his speeches. The most recent one is BRICS speech, you know. Yeah. Turkey is growing up relations with African countries, especially with sub-Saharan Africa, and works for increasing the trade volume with these countries. Growing up very friendly relations with African nations, Turkey is also considering investment opportunities in content, which the content will benefit a lot. I think Turkey also takes problems of Africa seriously and gives message to developed nations, which holds the lion's share of world wealth. Turkey is also very influential for Africa because Turkey is seen as a pioneer for many reasons for African nations, such as political side, history, economic development, influential role, and its impact on Eastern nations also. Turkey took a leading role in organization of Islamic cooperation also in recent years, and that's very influential for, especially for Muslim majority countries of Africa. I think Turkey has an advantageous place for this race, I think, against big world powers.
Yeah, true. Mr. Yaburi from Ankara, he said Turkey has an advantage in Africa due to the lack of colonial or imperial past of Turkey in African countries. How do you think Africans are welcoming Turkey in Africa?
Since the declaration of the African Action Plan by Ankara in 1998, Turkey has had a comprehensive approach towards Africa in a multidimensional level. For example, you should be aware that when it declared the year 2005 the African year and became a non-regional member of the African Development Bank in 2008, as well as joining the African Union as an observer in 2005, Ankara has been able to define a different approach that the United States and other traditional powers have not been able to do, because it has both continental, regional, and individual country approach. So this kind of strategy is quite comprehensive. You know that Turkey is one of the countries with highest numbers of embassies in Africa, as well as its development agency, TIC, has also a huge number of offices in the region, about 15. So it is indeed competing with the big boys in trying to spread its influence in Africa, and its success will count on its ability to sustain the already strategies that have been put in place. Remember that it's not only engaging with Africa at the continental level. Its embassies, for example, in Tanzania is accredited to the East African Community. Its embassies in the West Africa are accredited to the ECOWAS regional bloc, as well as the SADC. So this kind of multi-level approach is one that is unique and probably made grant the country success in the long run.
All right. Lastly, I'm going to ask you this question: what does this mean to the Africans and Africa in general? What does this development and those advancement mean to Africans and Africa?
Like any other country, Africa is in their need of capital. It is in their need of foreign direct investment, and the arrival of different actors with different alternatives for capital and foreign direct investment, as well as humanitarian, technical, and mechanical assistance, we think that Africa is in the right direction in terms of its relationship and engagement with external actors. But African leaders also need to remember that the development of the continent can only go so far with support from external actors, and much of the effort needs to be brought back into the continent itself. For example, there is urgent need to reevaluate and do comprehensive analysis of what the continent is worth. There is need, for example, to look at the human resource and what it can be able to produce, as well as be able to ensure efficiency in the way resources are being spent in the continent, something that they're still struggling to do for many years.
Thank you, Mr. Enver. Lastly, how do you think Turkey can make a positive impact in Africa and to Africans?
I think the presence of Turkey is very important for Africa and very positive for Africa also in terms of both economic and humanitarian development also. Turkey has the most friendly stance to Africa and more concerned, more interested with Africa's problems compared to other countries, especially with the developed ones. Turkey always supported the African nations and is continuing to do it. For example, Turkish Airlines has the most direct flights many of the African countries. Many of the global aviation companies have not because of some of the issues, for example, illness concerns maybe. And Turkey creates an important trade and business hub for Africa because of this factor also. I think because many of the transactions we need to use airlines for business trips, for export and import, the deliveries, for many things will be done by the airway, of course. And also visa liberalization with Turkey and many African countries is very important because it will be it's a boundary that would be easier for businessmen for their trips, and their investments also will have a positive impact on investment on the continent. Turkey also hold up humanitarian aid for many African countries. Turkish Army and Turkish Red Crescents have a presence in Africa and taking place in humanitarian social activities. They give medical aid and humanitarian aid to people of Africa. President Mr. Erdogan was the first non-African leader to visit Somalia, with many of his businessmen with him in terror days, we remember. And Turkish investment increased with a huge percentage in a short time in that country, we remember. Same issues for other countries also. And Turkey is continuing to growing up relations with that nation, searching for investments, and as a role of assistance in many issues also.
All right. Lastly, Mr. Nyaburi, can you tell us how can Turkey make a positive impact to Africans? And you have less than a minute because we are running out of time.
Turkey has already made important strides in the continent. The only gap that is remaining is that perhaps academic and researchers need to work much closer in helping Africa find sustainable solutions to some of the challenges. Areas such as renewable energy, urban planning, manufacturing, and agriculture are areas that African policymakers as well as scholars can benefit from Turkey through strategic partnerships.
True. Thank you very much, Mr. Nyaburi from Ankara. Thank you very much, Mr. Enver ERKAN. It's nice to have you in Africa.